5.2 billion people live in countries where debt service payments are higher than all their social and climate spending combined. If you split that up, you can see that the debt service is on average 3 times the education spending, about 5 times the health spending, about 10 times the social protection spending, about 25 times the climate spending. So it's just ridiculous when you get down to that level.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Equals, the podcast about inequality. Probably the world's best podcast about inequality. And I'm Max, one of the presenters.
Welcome, and I'm Grazielli.
Grazie. Great to be back together. The last time we were on the podcast, we were talking about New Year's resolutions. I said I'd go to the gym, and you said you would restart your kickboxing career. And I did go to the gym yesterday for the first time. And they had big TV screens, and lo and behold, it was showing kickboxing. I've never seen kickboxing before. I have to say, it looked really, really dangerous. Are you sure you should be doing it?
First, congratulations for doing it and for going to the gym. And I also went to my first kickboxing class this year, and I injured my ankle.
You hurt your ankle for the first class?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not actually that surprised. It looked very, very dangerous. It's just a suggestion as a friend. Maybe you should think about a different hobby.
Probably stick with fighting inequality. But anyway, who are we interviewing today?
We're interviewing a really, really fascinating man, Matthew Martin. He's a very old friend of mine, and we've been working together, campaigning together for at least 20 years, maybe longer. And he runs a fantastic organisation called Development Finance International. And they have spent the last 30 years helping governments and civil society to get the best financing, helping them get their debts cancelled, helping them do things like raise taxes or get more aid, and to fight poverty and to fight inequality. He's a really, really interesting man, and it's a fascinating interview. Should we get into it?
Yes, it's brilliant. Let's listen.
So, Matthew, welcome to Equals. Finally getting you on the podcast. I'm so excited about this, and really, really great to hear your insights on debt, but also firstly, just want to hear a bit about you. I mean, we've known each other for more than 20 years, but maybe you can tell the listeners, why do you care so much about inequality?
Well, I suppose it was how I grew up, really. I lived very briefly and reluctantly in South Africa under apartheid, where black children were supposed to be stuck with their grandparents into what we euphemistically called the homelands, and only blacks of working age were allowed anywhere near the whites. But one of the women who worked in our block of flats had sort of smuggled her son, who was the same age as me, about 8, into the building, and we used to play together. And one day a bunch of white thugs from the same block decided it would be a fun afternoon to pick up bricks, rocks, and anything else they could find in a skip nearby and try to stone us to death. Thank God my aunt showed up and stopped the police arresting, really ironically, not the thugs, but the black boy for being in the wrong place.
You're joking. They were trying to kill you and they arrested him instead.
Well, they tried to, and my aunt, fortunately, was a very upright member of the local community and stopped them. But, then you come back to Britain, and I'm sure you will recognise this, Max, as well, that in the British class system, when we first got back, my mother was running around the country doing a very busy job, and I went to what's known in this country as public school. As you know, it's actually private school for 3 months. And then I went on to government comprehensive schools, and I just realised from that how inequality was completely institutionalised in Britain by a sort of schooling apartheid, which continues to this day. So I think if you've got your eyes open, you can't miss the inequality and the injustice it produces.
Yeah, I think you're right. The thing that you're most expert on, and we're going to focus on today, is also debt. So how did you get into analysis of debt, campaigning on debt? How did you end up there?
I suppose I was at university, and I was looking for something that would make me equally passionate to work on. And I realised that the worst injustice at that point, as Willy Brandt pointed out in his famous report on the global economy, this is like 1982 or so, was debt, which was already crushing people's lives in Africa, Latin America and beyond. And then I went to the LSE and did a PhD, which became a book called The Crumbling Facade of Africa's Debt Negotiations, Chaos, Arrogance and Secrecy, right, because it was just entirely up to what the creditors felt like giving the countries and had no relationship to, what the people in the countries needed. And therefore, that was what inspired me to fight that injustice. It's what I've been doing most of all for the last 30 years.
So, Matthew, that's interesting, your history, working a lot on inequality and then on debt. How do they relate? How does one impact the other one?
So, look, some debt can be really good. Everybody has to borrow occasionally, and countries have to borrow to invest in all the things that their citizens want. But when the debt gets too high, it's ordinary citizens who pay the price. And frankly, the creditors are nearly all rich, whether they're external or domestic, and they're dominated by financial institutions and people who are making money out of their wealth held in financial investments. I was listening the other day to your talk with Thomas Piketty, and he was stressing all of that. And those who pay the cost of the debt crisis are poorer citizens who get less spending by governments on education, on health, on social protection, or on fighting the climate and nature crises. And they get cuts or stagnation in public sector wages, and they get people coming and telling them to have austerity to bring down the debt burden. And you know, because we've worked together for several years now on the commitment to reducing inequality index, that especially since the COVID crisis, governments have been cutting social spending and increasing taxes on ordinary citizens across the world, mainly in order to pay rapidly rising debt service. So when there's a debt crisis, basically the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and inequality gets much worse.
We campaigned together, and you were a very big part of the Jubilee debt cancellation campaigning and movement, you know, from 98 to kind of 2005. That was an amazing campaign, and certainly it was my first experience of campaigning on these things, and an enormous amount was achieved, because I think now people look at the debt crisis in Africa and they think, oh, it's always been that way, or there's nothing we can do about it. But I think what we did back then is worth repeating. Can you tell us about what your role was in that amazing campaign?
So I had two roles really, or maybe three. One was, and the most important was, that we helped the countries who were in a debt crisis to fight their corner for getting the maximum debt relief. Because although they made announcements at the global level about the amount of relief they were going to provide, quite often they tried to, get out of them and not implement them properly. But also I was advising the like-minded governments, as they used to call them, the ones who wanted to provide debt relief, on how to do it best. And also I was a technical advisor to the Jubilee debt group of CSOs and other stakeholders on, how to fight about this. And I think the huge achievement that we made was in getting everybody to admit there was a problem, first of all, and then getting them to agree to bring down the debt service to only 10% of countries' budgets. And that allowed countries to double or treble their social spending. And then they could make massive progress in getting free primary or secondary education, or having huge expansions of healthcare spending. But even beyond that, in Rwanda, for example, they spent a lot of the money on rural roads and small markets in order to help people sell their produce and make off-farm incomes and stop them fighting over land, which was one of the main causes of the genocide. And I think the reason we managed to get that was the combination of massive popular campaigning. I remember going on drop the debt marches with everybody, lots of advocacy behind the scenes, coming up with solutions which were workable and affordable, and very hard lobbying and technical work by the countries themselves. There were some evaluators a few years ago who calculated that the countries actually got for themselves about $27 billion out of the $100 billion that was cancelled.
Because they negotiated so hard, is that what
exactly? And really, getting them. I remember one year we twinned 7 heads of state with each head of state in G7, and they basically spent the whole year lobbying each of their twins to do more. And at the end of that, we got 17 billion more. So, really you can achieve that change. I suppose the big thing we didn't achieve, and, we all realize that now, is we didn't change to what is known as the architecture, which sounds very boring, but we didn't basically change the system so that it's still basically the creditors who take all the decisions. And then, post 2015, that group decided it was time to begin cutting grant aid and to suggest to countries that they go to borrow in financial markets. And when we've done analysis recently of what is the cause of the new debt crisis, it's not, corruption. I'm not saying corruption isn't an issue, but it's not fundamentally the country's policies. It's basically the countries that went to borrow in financial markets are back in a worse mess than they were in before.
Yeah, and I think, it's like one of those things. If it was an individual country's fault, then why is it happening in all the countries of the global south at once?
Exactly.
Clearly something has happened at a structural level. So now we're back in such a terrible situation with countries spending so much money servicing their debt. It does look very familiar to me, and it reminds me of of those days, but I think it's also different in some ways too. What are the similarities and what are the differences?
So you'll remember, Max, back to a lot of the what were then called heavily indebted poor countries, which got their debt relief back then. They'd been having debt problems for ages, and so most of the money they owed was already in arrears, and they weren't paying a huge amount. There were some exceptions to that, but they weren't paying a huge amount out in actual debt service payment. Well, the difference now is they are paying out a huge amount in debt service payment, and we have got this database called Debt Service Watch, which you can find online, which shows that at the moment 5.2 billion people are living in countries where their debt service payments are higher than all their social spending and climate spending combined.
Say that fact again, because it was brilliant.
Yeah, so 5.2 billion people live in countries where debt service payments are higher than all their social and climate spending combined. And that's higher than the numbers you'll see quoted by some other studies, because we include domestic debt in that, and we include all the principal payments as well, whereas some people just are quoting interest payments when I've seen, the most famous one most people talk about is 3.4 billion, which is the UNCTAD data. Same data as ours, but they don't include all the different bits of debt service.
But whichever way you look at it, government after government spending more paying back their rich creditors than they are in schools or hospitals or other things like that.
Absolutely, and if you split that up, you can see that the debt service is on average 3 times the education spending, about 5 times the health spending, about 10 times the social protection spending, about 25 times the climate spending. So it's just ridiculous when you get down to that level.
But what else is different then? What's because I've heard people say that, or two things, that this debt crisis is very much about money that's owed to China. And I've also heard people say that it's about money that's owed to private creditors. And I'm not sure what that means. And like the bond market. And who are these people that are owed so much money?
So, look, I think the things that are genuinely different, so let me deal with those first, and then the things that really aren't and are often used as excuses by people in order to do nothing about it. So the things that are really different, and I think it's absolutely wonderful that the citizens of the Global South are shouting much louder than they did before about the need for debt relief on new grounds like reparations, decolonization, paying for climate justice. But also, another complication in the Global South is that most of them over the last 15 years have developed these domestic financial markets where the cost of the debt is astronomically high and twice as high as the cost on external debt, and that's part of the problem. But then the things which are not are precisely the ones that you just quoted. You often hear people saying, oh, things are different. I met someone very senior in Washington who was involved in the previous initiative very closely, and he just looked at me when I said, can't we do the same thing again, and said, oh no, the context is different. And what he meant by that was we've gone away from commercial bank creditors, so banks used to lend to developing countries back in the 1980s and 1990s, to bond creditors, which is basically governments issuing bonds and lots of people buying them. But actually there's no difference between the two. Both of those types of commercial creditors have in their day acted like the Wild West in terms of overcharging countries. And, we've even had people complaining in Britain about, and in most global north countries, about the amount that bondholders charge. And, refusing completely to provide relief. I remember hearing Rwanda speak very passionately in one of the UN meetings last year about the fact that they were advised to issue a bond at 8% above what the US would pay for it because their reputation was so bad. And then when they issued it, 5 times as many people wanted to buy it as the amount they wanted to sell, which was, at least for me, anyone who knows the basics of economics, is that basically means that you were giving them far too high an interest rate because the bond market is completely unregulated. The people who advise governments on how to issue bonds, there's nothing stopping them setting the prices very high or whatever they feel like doing. And then on China, China has been a very generous provider of debt relief since about 1977. I don't want to sound like I'm a China-phile. There are lots of things that China does wrong. But when it comes to providing debt relief, they've been at the forefront since 1997, providing as much relief, if not more, than Western countries. What's happened recently is the scale of its lending, and that it's been lending less cheap, more expensive money to countries. And it is now doing a lot of cancellation or postponement of the service on that as well. But it doesn't like being corralled by people like the G20 or the G7 into doing things. It likes to do it their own way. So sometimes you don't see so much of that. But there are wonderful books that have been produced by people in Johns Hopkins and other places that just show the scale of the debt relief China is now providing, which is partly why they've they've had to cut back their new lending because they can't afford to do both.
I would like to go back to one point where you were talking about domestic debt and external debt, because there is one big theory now, the MMT, the Modern Monetary Policy, where they talk a little bit about this, and what they say is that domestic debt is not that big problem as external debt because you can't break on your own currency. So I was willing to hear a little bit more from you, since you said that this is a major problem.
Yeah, look, I mean, we could probably have a whole separate podcast about modern monetary theory and inequality as well, although probably the better person to talk to about that is Anne Pettifor. But the problem in smaller countries, even if you're issuing debt in your own markets in domestic currency, yes, you don't have the risk which you have with foreign debt in other currencies, that if your currency collapses, then suddenly your debt payments will go shooting up. But you do still have very high interest rates on those domestic debts. It varies between countries, but if I take somewhere like Uganda, where the interest rate on domestic debt is something like 16%, which is about 10% above inflation, and that's a massive cost. It's even worse in Kenya. And so you kind of have got a terrible choice to make when you don't really want to choose either of them. One is to borrow externally and have the risk that if your currency collapses, your budget will be blown up, or the other is that you borrow domestically and you have a massive interest rate to pay up front.
So given all this, given the crisis we're in, given what we learnt from last time, what should we be doing now to solve this current debt crisis?
Well, we've done some analysis for the G20 and other people, looking at exactly how much you need to do and which countries need to benefit. And we found that you could do a huge amount without massive cost. And the way to do that is to focus on cancelling the current payments on the debt rather than the whole debt stock. We've talked of it as a 10-year debt service holiday. Now, by that, I don't mean what they did a few years ago during COVID, which was to sort of postpone the debt service payments and add more interest on top of them. So like 3 years down the road, you had a much worse debt burden than you started with. I mean, actually cancelling it. You could maybe postpone it for such a long time at an almost zero interest rate that it had the same effect, but preferably cancel it. And there are three groups of countries. One is about 40 lower income countries, which don't usually go to the markets to borrow, so they wouldn't lose their market access or have any risk of losing their market access as a result of going for debt relief. And they need fundamental debt relief. And there we've said, and there's now the HOPE initiative out there, which has adopted this target, we should be targeting bringing down their debt service from current levels of about 45% of revenue to about 10%. And that would free up a massive amount of money to spend on the SDGs. Then the second group of countries are about another 25, which are already feeling really strongly the effects of the climate crisis, regularly hit by natural disasters. But, we also feel this should apply to countries which are hit by earthquakes or, region-specific pandemics or whatever it is. And you should move to cancelling the debt service during maybe a 10-year period as well, so that they can recover without being in the middle of a debt crisis. And there's the third group of countries which go to these financial markets all the time, and they might not, particularly want to have to do it, but they have to do it because basically they're borrowing more to repay what they've already borrowed to fund their budgets. And they need much more fundamental measures to reduce their interest costs. And that applies to countries like Brazil and South Africa and some of the really big emerging markets that you wouldn't think are in a debt crisis, but are actually paying a lot of money out of their budgets on debt.
Actually, it made me think of something, Matthew. Like maybe one of the differences between now and then is that it feels like the majority of governments on earth, even OECD governments, are facing a massive debt crisis. So do you think that makes kind of structural change more likely? I mean, it feels like everybody owes these days, not just developing countries.
Yeah, look, we just took in our Debt Service Watch database, we just added in the OECD countries, and they had among the worst debt burdens in the world. The difference is that their interest costs are a lot lower generally, so they can borrow massive amounts, 200% of the economy, and they still can just about afford the service payments on it. But yes, I mean, everybody has the same problem, which is that what we've done over the last 20 years in particular, and above all since the financial crisis, is we've basically said, okay, we all need to borrow from the bond markets, and we all need to borrow more and more and more to offset the financial crisis, the COVID crisis, everything else that comes along. And yes, we're all in a mess.
It's interesting because every time we're talking about some limits to debt and to think that there could be alternatives, we get to a point where it's about also the interest rate. How could the interest rate be controlled so that debt is not that problem so strong anymore?
And that's true in a lot of countries across the world, which are being, I think, wrongly advised that the only way to contain inflation is to keep interest rates high, when there's precious little evidence from any economic history that that's an effective way to contain inflation. I think it's much more interesting to see what's happening in Europe in particular, where the European Central Bank seems to have got the message that you need to bring interest rates down if you want to have any growth at all. And so I think that's one way to do it. It's the way that, for example, Japan has done it, where they've got virtually no interest rate at all. The other thing I was suggesting, yes, issue interest rates, issue bonds at fixed interest rates. That still happens in quite a few countries. Rwanda, until recently Ethiopia, and you could easily do that. You can issue bonds to particular groups. So if you're a country with a lot of people overseas, and they would normally send back remittances, money of their own to help their families. If they feel like they want to invest in their own country, you can target them and they will give you a lower interest rate. Or some countries which have a big Islamic population, big Muslim population, have found that you can issue Islamic financial instruments. And because people want to contribute to their own country through those, they also will ask for a lower interest rate. It's not called an interest rate because that would be in violation of Islamic law, but it's the same sort of thing, a much lower cost. So there are lots of ways of doing it. It's just a matter of, I think it's partly a matter of governments getting their own act together, but it's also ultimately going to be a matter of what do we do to regulate bond markets and to stop the worst behaviours. Because as I say, it's like the Wild West, and as long as the financial markets have got a free rein to do whatever they want, and the governments just have to absorb the cost. There's this phrase about privatizing the profits and socializing the losses, which is used. I'm sure that would have come up in the podcast you did with Anna Marriott on health privatization. And it's the same here. So, all the private sector debt holders take the profits and all the governments and the citizens pay for the losses.
And it seems like that for the market to be able to do whatever they want and have no regulation, they use a strategy of saying not rules, let's say, kind of create some myths. One is the one that you said now, that the only way to control inflation is by having high interest rates. And we have seen that it's not. And another myth that we hear a lot is that we can't provide debt relief because countries are corrupt. How can we prevent this kind of argument?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the things I hear most. I remember addressing European Parliament a few years ago, and they said, oh, well, surely the reason we're back in a debt crisis is because countries are corrupt. And I don't want to deny that corruption in debt contracts is widespread. Of course, it takes two to do a bribe, the briber and the bribee, or whatever you call them. The very first work I did on debt was in São Tomé and Príncipe, which, Graziella, you probably know because it's a country that speaks Portuguese, a former Portuguese colony. Little couple of islands south of Nigeria, for those people who don't know where São Tomé is. Wonderful country, but they had managed to borrow a huge amount, including a loan, I won't mention the creditor country, but including a loan of about 3 times the size of their whole economy, which was investigated before I got involved and was shown to have 97% of the money, which was basically about $50 million, going into the pockets of the people who had organized the loan. So that was an export credit agency in a Western country and the banks, and a little bit was left over for the ministers who signed the contracts in São Tomé, but about 95% of it went to the creditor country. We went to the creditor country to try to negotiate this, and we didn't realize that the person we were sitting opposite had been let out of jail where he was for much more widespread corruption to talk to us. But he basically tried to bribe the ministers I was with, and then tried to bribe me with a nice offer of a 3-month holiday. And when we said no to all of this, he looked at us and said, gentlemen, you have to realize this country can be very dangerous for people who don't have good friends. We rang up the people in that country who had invited us, who were on the right side of the issues, and they said, we can't protect you. You'd better get on the next plane out of here. So that's where corruption can get to and how much people will do to steal money. So I know about this and I feel passionately about it. So I think there are 2 things we need to do about it. One is we need really strong anti-corruption laws, both in creditor and debtor countries. And I'm a bit proud of Britain in that about 20 years ago, 2010, just at the end of the Gordon Brown government, beginning of the David Cameron government, we passed a law which was very strong and said any debts which are contracted corruptly cannot be repaid. And creditors can't sue for their repayment. About 12 months ago, Mozambique took that to court in Britain, and not only were they told they didn't need to pay the $2 billion which people had lent corruptly to their own government, but they were also told that because everybody had reacted to this corruption in Mozambique by suspending all their aid and it had caused massive damage to the economy, that they could have damages of $4 billion because of the wrecking of their economy. A lot of other countries need very similar laws. They already exist, for example, in the US and South Africa. So we're pushing to do that through what's called the UN Convention Against Corruption, to make sure that we have strong anti-corruption laws in all countries. And then the other thing that's really important is that we fight corruption via transparency and accountability. You hear a lot about transparency, and there's a thing called radical transparency being promoted by people at the moment. But mostly they mean by that providing more information to creditors or putting contracts up online somewhere where citizens can find them. We did a big study a couple of years ago on this, and we found that it's not just about that. It's about building the capacity of parliamentarians and citizens in the countries of the global south to stop these bad deals, and building the capacity of the government officials to actually produce the numbers and documents that citizens need in a readable, accessible format. Finally, you remember on Max, back to the days of the previous lot of debt relief, you want to avoid corruption in spending the proceeds of debt relief. There was a kind of revolution in accountability at that stage. Countries were asked to design their own poverty reduction strategies, which had really strong participation by citizens. And then there were committees of government, civil society, and the development partners who oversaw the spending. And that's why the debt relief got to where it was supposed to get to, and we made a massive amount of progress on the development goals. And what we need now is to update that. We need, I suppose you would call them, just green transition strategies. So basically showing how countries would spend the money to fight the three huge crises the world is confronted by: inequality, but also climate and nature. And if we've got those structures in place and we have adequate debt relief, we could make really massive progress on the SDGs. And also, we're just about to get ready to adopt a whole new set of global development goals. Maybe we'd have enough money to pay for those too.
Thank you, Matthew. That was a real tour de force and so illuminating on the history of debt, the debt crisis, and what we can do to combat the huge hole that many countries are in right now. So thank you so much for doing that.
Pleasure to be on the podcast. I think, just all I want to say to listeners is get out there, get involved in the movement for debt cancellation, because the reason that none of this is happening at the moment is that world leaders are not prioritizing this crisis because they're dealing with so many other things. We need an even stronger popular movement than we had back in the 1990s and 2000s, so that leaders start caring about global development and ending hunger and poverty across the world.
Good call to action. Thank you, Matthew.
Yes, thank you. Wow, great interview. What are your reflections on it, Max?
Well, it brought back a lot of memories, to be honest. That campaign to cancel debts. At first, when it started, I was living in Malawi and we were living in a teacher's college. It hadn't been open for months because the government had no money to train teachers or build schools. And, over the coming years, I then came back to the UK and we were part of the incredible campaign to cancel debts. Malawi had their debts cancelled, and they used that money to train thousands of new teachers, build new schools. It made a huge, huge difference. And it was an amazing moment and a great example of how change can happen. And yes, we might be back in a debt crisis now, but we had a long period where the poorest countries in the world did have some space and some money to spend on the things that matter. So, yeah, it reminded me of that, to be honest, Kratzy. What about you?
Something that caught my attention is that when we talk about that, there are always some myth ideas that come up. And I think that Matthew was brilliant in addressing them. One was this idea that the only way to fight inflation is to have high interest rates. And this kind of destroys countries' possibilities to have money for what is needed for people, for the planet, because all goes to pay service debt. And the other one is the idea that, we can't have debt cancellation because countries are corrupt and the money wouldn't go anyway to what is needed. And he was really good in showing that these are myths and shouldn't be brought to the discussion so often.
Yeah, and I think especially on the corruption one, and I saw this myself, in Africa when it happened last time, is that civil society becomes mobilized as well. They hold their governments to account. They look at the budget. They scrutinize. So there are things that you can do to mobilize to ensure that this money is spent on the right things. And I saw that happen last time, and there's no reason why it couldn't happen again. So yeah, really, really interesting interview. So we've got loads of really cool episodes coming up. I think we're going to talk about Norway. I think we're going to find out about the new international panel on inequality, what's happening with that. Lots of things coming up in the next few weeks. So please stay tuned in to Equals. Tell your friends. Sign up if you haven't. www.equals.ink. And we'll talk to you next time.
Talk to you next time. Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.